The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, and Alena did not open it for 3 hours. She already knew what was inside. She had known since the previous week, when she overheard two of the household maids whispering in the kitchen corridor, their voices low but not low enough. She had stood just outside the door with a cup of tea going cold in her hand, and she had listened to the word that would change everything. The solution. Lord Dominic Hartwell, the Duke of Ashford, had made his decision. And he had done it without once looking her in the eye. Alena set the unopened letter on the drawing room table and walked to the window. Outside, the grounds of Ashford Hall stretched wide and grey under a November sky. She had walked every one of those paths. She knew which stone near the east garden wobbled when it rained, which rose bush had thorns that reached out like fingers, which bench caught the morning light just right in summer. She had spent 6 years learning this place the way she had learned her husband, carefully, patiently, with a devotion that she had never once asked to be repaid. She was 31 years old. She had given this marriage everything she had. And she was standing at the window of a house that was about to stop being her home, holding herself so still that she could feel her own heartbeat. Dominic was not a cruel man. That was the part Alena could never fully explain to anyone, not even to herself. He was not the kind of man who raised his voice or said vicious things in anger. He was cold. He was controlled. He had a way of making a decision and then simply executing it, as if the feelings of other people were a detail he had already accounted for and set aside. That composure, which she had once found steadying, now felt like the most devastating thing about him. They had met at a charity dinner 8 years ago. She was there with her father, a retired judge who still moved in high social circles despite his modest income. Dominic had been pointed out to her before they were introduced, and she had watched him from across the room for 20 minutes before she formed any opinion at all. He was tall, well-dressed, and deeply uncomfortable with small talk. She had found that interesting. Most men in his position performed his very well. He did not bother to perform. When they were introduced, he had looked at her directly. Not the way men look at women they want to impress, but the way a person looks when they are actually paying attention. He had asked her one question, something about the legal case her father had once written about, and they had spent the next hour talking in the corner while everyone around them cycled through pleasantries. She had fallen in love with his mind before she had given her heart any chance to weigh in. Their courtship was quiet and deliberate. He was not effusive. He did not send flowers or write long letters. But he showed up. He arrived at exactly the time he said he would. He remembered every detail she mentioned in passing. When her father fell ill the following spring, Dominic had arranged for a doctor from the city, quietly, without being asked. He had told her about it only afterward, without making it a gesture that required her gratitude. She had married him 2 years after they met, in the chapel on his estate, with her aunt and a handful of close friends as witnesses. She had worn her mother's pearls. He had held her hand during the ceremony with a grip that was surprisingly warm for a man who was otherwise so measured. She had believed, truly believed, that what they had would hold. The years that followed were not unhappy, but they were not easy either. Dominic carried the weight of his title the way some men carry a debt they have inherited. The expectation of an heir was not something his family had ever stated openly. It simply lived in every room of Ashford Hall, in the portraits of his ancestors lining the great staircase, in the way his solicitors occasionally mentioned the estate's entailment, in the polite silences at formal dinners when other couples arrived with children in tow. Alena had wanted children. She had wanted them before she understood they were also what the world expected of her as a duchess. That distinction mattered to her, even if it did not matter to anyone else. The first time she lost a pregnancy, she was 25. It was early, and the doctor said these things were common, and she had held onto that word, common, the way a person holds a rope in the dark. Dominic had been gentle that week. He had sat with her in the evenings without needing to fill the silence with words. It was one of the times she had loved him most. The second loss came when she was 27. By then the gentleness had taken on a shape she did not quite like. It was still present, but it had grown careful, as if he were managing her rather than grieving with her. She noticed the difference but did not name it. After the third loss, he stopped sitting with her in the evenings. She told herself he grieved differently. She told herself men of his background were not taught to show what they carried. She gave him every explanation she could find, and when she ran out of explanations, she gave him time. She gave him years. She poured herself into the life they had built, into the household, the charity work, the duties of a duke's wife, into learning the names of every tenant farmer on the estate and what their families needed each season. She made herself indispensable not because she was calculating, but because staying busy kept the fear from taking up too much space in her chest. She did not know when Dominic began to see her differently. She only knew that somewhere in the last year, the way he looked at her had changed. It was not anger. It was something worse. It was assessment. She would catch him watching her at dinner, at events, even in the quieter moments at home, and his eyes held the expression of a man reviewing something he had already made up his mind about. She had tried once to talk to him about it. She had sat across from him in his study and said, calmly and clearly, that she felt something between them had shifted and that she wanted to understand what was wrong. He had told her she was tired. He had suggested she take a trip to visit her aunt. He had returned to the papers on his desk. She had not tried again. Now the letter sat on the drawing room table. Alena finally walked back to it, picked it up, and opened it with the small silver letter opener she had used every morning for 6 years. The paper was thick and formal. The language was precise and bloodless. The sum of 6 years of marriage, reduced to 3 paragraphs and a solicitor's seal. She read it twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and set it down. She did not scream. She did not cry. Something inside her went very quiet, the way a house goes quiet after a door is shut for the last time. That evening, Dominic came to find her in the library. He stood in the doorway, and she stood near the bookcase, and neither of them moved for a long moment. "I assume you received the letter," he said. "I did," she said. He did not apologize. He did not explain. He said only that the papers would be finalized within the month, that she would be given a settlement, and that he hoped she would find the process straightforward. Alena looked at him for a long time before she answered. She looked at his face, at the jaw she had once traced with her fingers in the dark, at the eyes she had once described to her aunt as the most honest eyes she had ever seen. She looked at the man she had given her whole adult life to, and she said, very quietly, "Is there nothing you want to say to me?" He was quiet. Then he said, "I think everything that needs to be said has been said." She nodded. She turned back to the bookcase. She heard his footsteps leave the room. She stood in the library for a long time after that, her hand resting on the spine of a book she had no intention of reading. She did not know yet about the child. She did not yet know that the thing Dominic had spent 6 years waiting for, the year he had all but decided she could not give him, was already there, already real, already beginning. She did not know any of that. What she knew was this. She was leaving. She was going to walk out of Ashford Hall with her dignity still around her like a coat, and she was going to build something new, even if she could not yet see what shape it would take. She began packing that night. The morning she left Ashford Hall, it was not yet light. Alena had lived inside this house long enough to know which floorboards creaked and which doors groaned, and she moved through the dark corridors with the quiet of someone who had spent years learning to be careful. She carried 2 bags. Everything else she left behind. The paintings, the china, the furniture they had chosen together in a London shop one cold afternoon, when the marriage still felt like something they were building rather than something she was maintaining alone. She left all of it. She wanted none of the weight. The housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Clifton who had worked at Ashford Hall for 20 years, was already awake in the kitchen when Alena passed through. Mrs. Clifton did not say anything. She pressed the warm parcel into Elena's hands, a wrapped piece of bread and 2 hard-boiled eggs, and then she stepped back and looked at her with the kind of steadiness that can only come from someone who has seen enough of life to know that some departures cannot be argued with. "Thank you," Alena said. Mrs. Clifton nodded once. "Take care of yourself, my lady." Alena stepped out into the cold before the title could land too heavily on her chest. The carriage she had arranged the day before was waiting at the far end of the lane, away from the main gate. The driver was a young man she had hired from the village, someone who did not know her face or her name. She gave him the address in the countryside, where her aunt lived in a small house that smelled of dried lavender and old books, and then she sat back in the carriage and looked out the window as Ashford Hall disappeared behind the trees. She did not let herself look back for long. Her aunt, Harriet Voss, was 63 years old and had the bearing of a woman who had long ago decided not to be surprised by anything. She had never married. She had supported herself through her early years by teaching music and in her later ones by renting the upper floors of her house to quiet tenants, and she had built a life that was small in size and large in quality, exactly the kind of life Elena had once found difficult to understand and now found herself deeply grateful for. Harriet opened the door before Elena had finished climbing the front steps. She had been watching from the window. She did not ask what happened. She pulled Elena inside, set the bags down, and made tea. They sat at the small kitchen table, and Harriet talked about the garden and the latest letter from a mutual friend and the strange behavior of a robin that had taken to perching on her windowsill every morning, and she kept talking until the tension in Elena's shoulders had begun, very slowly, to release. It was only later, when the tea had gone cold and the lamp had burned lower, that Harriet reached across the table and put her hand over Elena's. "You do not have to explain anything tonight," she said. Elena looked down at their joined hands. "I know," she said. "But I want to." She told her aunt everything. Not the grand version, not the simplified one she might have given to someone who did not already know the particular weight of what it meant to be dismissed by someone who had once chosen you. She told Harriet the truth in full detail, the slow cooling of Dominic's attention, the formality that had replaced intimacy, the letter, the conversation in the library, the look on his face when he said everything that needed to be said had already been said. Harriet listened without interrupting. When Elena finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He is a fool." "He is not a fool," Elena said. "Then he is worse than a fool," Harriet said. "He is a man who had something good and traded it for something he thought would be better, without understanding what he had." Elena did not answer that. She stared at the lamp. She had been thinking the same thing, but hearing it said aloud made her chest hurt in a way that was different from the cold she had been carrying since the letter arrived. "I will be all right," she said. "I just need time." "You have all the time in the world," Harriet said. "You are 31 years old. You are clever and capable and you have survived 6 years of being loved by a man who did not understand what love required of him. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a great deal." Elena laughed despite herself. It was a short, tired laugh, but it was real. She slept that night in the room at the top of the stairs, in a narrow bed under a white quilt, and she slept more deeply than she had in months. She woke up early the next morning with nausea so sharp that she had to sit on the edge of the bed with her head down for several minutes before she could stand. She assumed it was the stress. She assumed the weeks of tension had finally found a physical form and that her body was doing what bodies do when they have been carrying too much. She drank water. She moved slowly. She told herself she would feel better by afternoon. She did not feel better by afternoon. By the third morning of waking with the same thick, rolling sickness, something shifted in the back of her mind, something small and quiet, like a door opening in a room she had kept locked for a long time. She counted back the weeks. She sat very still at the kitchen table while her aunt was out in the garden, and she counted back the weeks very carefully. Then she went to find her aunt. Harriet took her to see Dr. Wallace in the village, a kind, unhurried man who had delivered half the children in the surrounding area and who asked very few unnecessary questions. He examined her briefly, asked her several specific questions in a matter-of-fact tone, and then told her to sit down. "You are expecting a child," he said. "From what I can determine, you are approximately 5 to 6 weeks along." Elena sat in the chair in the doctor's small office and felt the world rearrange itself around her. She did not speak for a moment. The doctor gave her the moment without feeling it. 5 to 6 weeks. She calculated without trying to. Dominic had delivered the letter 12 days ago. Before that, there had been a week of silence between them, a formal, painful silence while he prepared what he was going to do. Which meant the child had been conceived before any of that. Before the letter. Before the conversation in the library. Before everything. She had been pregnant during all of it. She had been carrying this child through every cold evening, every quiet dinner, every moment of standing in the library listening to his footsteps leave the room. She had been pregnant when he told her she was no longer his wife. The thought hit her slowly, the way very large things do, like water rising rather than a wave crashing. She pressed her hand to her stomach. She did not know what she felt. She could not yet name it. There was something that was not quite joy and not quite grief but contained elements of both. There was something else underneath it, something firmer, like ground. "Are you all right?" the doctor asked. "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true in a way that surprised her, "Yes, I think I am." She did not tell Harriet until they were back in the kitchen. Her aunt listened, and then went very still for a moment, and then stood up and put the kettle on, which was what Harriet did whenever the ward delivered information that required her to collect herself. "Does he know?" Harriet asked. "No," Elena said. "Will you tell him?" Elena looked at the table. She looked at her own hands. She had asked herself that question from the moment the doctor's words had settled into something real, and she had found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she already knew the answer. "Not yet," she said. Harriet turned to look at her. She did not say anything. "I need to think," Elena said. "I need to understand what I want. Not what I am supposed to do, not what anyone expects of me. What I actually want." "That is fair," Harriet said carefully. "I loved him," Elena said. "I am not sure I can say that clearly enough. I loved him for a very long time. And he made a decision about our marriage without looking at me once, without a single conversation, without giving me the chance to say anything at all. He decided I was not enough and he acted on that decision and he called it practical." She stopped. "I need to decide whether the existence of this child means I owe him something, or whether it means I have something to protect." Harriet set the tea down on the table. She sat across from her niece, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Those two things," Harriet said slowly, "are not necessarily the same." "No," Elena agreed. "They are not." She spent the days that followed thinking, truly thinking, without distraction and without the pressure of anyone else's expectations. She walked the lanes around the village in the pale winter light. She sat by the window in the evenings with her hands in her lap. She read old letters she had kept in a small tin box for years, letters from her mother, who had died when Elena was 17, and a few from friends who had known her before she became a duchess and who had loved her when she was simply a quiet, thoughtful girl with a gift for paying attention. She thought about what kind of mother she wanted to be. She thought about what kind of childhood she wanted to give this child. She thought about Ashford Hall with its grand corridors and its portraits and its silence that lived in the walls, and she tried to imagine raising a child inside that silence, under the weight of a title, in a house where she had been made to feel like a problem to be solved. She thought about Dominic. She tried to be fair. She thought about the man who had held her hand at their wedding, who had arranged a doctor for her father without being asked, who had grieved beside her after the first loss in a way that had felt genuine. She thought about the man who had handed her a letter and told her everything that needed to be said had already been said. She thought about the gap between those two men, and she tried to understand whether that gap could ever be crossed. By the end of the week, she had her answer. She was going to stay in the village. She was going to raise this child here, in the quiet and the light, surrounded by people who did not need her to perform anything. She was going to build a life on her own terms, not out of bitterness, but out of love for the child growing inside her and a clear-eyed understanding of what that child deserved. She would not hide. She would not run. She would simply begin. She wrote to a correspondence house in the nearest town and inquired about translation work. She spoke French and German fluently, a legacy of a governess her father had employed when she was young, and she had a precise, clean way with written language that had been noted throughout her years as a duchess. She sold a pair of earrings, gold ones with small sapphires, that had been a gift from Dominic's mother. She opened a small account at the village bank under the name Mrs. Alena Voss. She did not tell Dominic. Not yet. She told herself she would know when the time was right. The winter passed, and then the spring, and Alena had learned the rhythms of the village the way she had once learned the rhythms of Ashford Hall, quietly, attentively, without rushing. She walked to the market on Saturdays. She knew the baker by name, a stout, cheerful man called Mr. Hobbs, who always gave her an extra roll without being asked and who had never, in all their brief conversations, asked her a single question about her past. She knew the woman who ran the post office, a sharp-eyed widow named Mrs. Dormont who missed nothing and said little. She knew the pair of elderly brothers who kept bees behind the church and who sometimes left a jar of honey on Harriet's doorstep with no note attached. It was a small life, and it fit her in the way that things fit when they belong to you rather than to the idea of you. The translation work had grown steadily. She was good at it, not just mechanically but in the deeper way, the way that understood what a sentence was actually trying to say beneath its surface, what tone a writer was reaching for and how to carry that tone across into another language without losing it. The correspondence house had started forwarding her more complex documents, legal papers, letters between business partners, once even a private memoir written by an elderly French woman who wanted it preserved in English for her grandchildren. Alena had spent 3 weeks on that one, and when she finished it she had sat very quietly for a while, feeling something she recognized as the satisfaction of work done with genuine care. The child moved for the first time on a warm April evening, and Alena was sitting at the desk by the window with a half-finished translation in front of her, and the feeling was so soft and so strange that she set down her pen and pressed both hands flat against her stomach and sat perfectly still, as if any movement might cause her to miss the rest of it. She sat there for a long time after that. She had told no one in the village about the circumstances of her life before she arrived. She had said only that she was a widow, which was not entirely untrue in the ways that mattered most, and people had accepted this without pressing further. It was the kind of village where privacy was understood to be something a person was entitled to, and she had been grateful for that in ways she had not expected. Harriet remained her one true confidant. They talked about everything, the pregnancy, the work, the shape of each passing week. They did not talk about Dominic often, but when they did, Alena tried to be honest about what she felt, which was something complicated and layered that did not resolve into either hatred or longing but occupied a quieter, more uncomfortable space between those things. She had thought about writing to him. Several times she had picked up a pen and held it over paper and found that she did not know how to begin. Not because she lacked words, but because she was still deciding what she wanted the telling to accomplish. If she wrote to say he had an heir coming, what was she actually asking for? Did she want him to come back? Did she want an apology? Did she want him to understand, in the clearest possible terms, what he had done? She did not know. And because she did not know, she said nothing. She told herself she was waiting for clarity. The summer arrived, and with it a heaviness that was both physical and something harder to name. She was large now, unmistakably, and she moved through the village with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who had made a kind of peace with her own body's demands. People were kind. Mrs. Hobbs at the bakery had started setting aside the sweet rolls Alena preferred without being asked. The doctor, old Dr. Wallace, checked on her every 2 weeks with the thoroughness of someone who understood that women in her condition needed to be looked after with particular care. On a morning in late July, while a summer storm was building somewhere out over the fields and the sky had gone the thick, particular grey that meant rain before noon, Alena received a letter she had not expected. It was not from Dominic. It was from his solicitor, a man she had met twice during the formal proceedings of the dissolution, and it was written in the careful, neutral language of legal correspondence. It informed her that there was a question arising from the original terms of the marriage contract that required clarification. It invited her, at her convenience, to respond through her own legal representative. She read it 3 times. Then she set it down. She did not feel panic. She felt something more controlled than that, a sharpening of attention, the kind that comes when you understand that the thing you have been waiting to deal with has decided not to wait any longer. She wrote back that afternoon through a local solicitor, a decent, methodical man named Mr. Graves who had helped her set up her account at the village bank and who she had since retained for exactly this kind of moment. She did not disclose the pregnancy in the letter. She simply acknowledged receipt and indicated she would be in contact. That evening, for the first time in several months, she allowed herself to think about Dominic directly, not as a sheep in the background of her decisions, but as the actual man she had married and lived with and believed in for years. She tried to imagine his face if she told him. She tried to imagine what he would feel, and whether feeling was even a category he was capable of engaging with when it involved something that had this many consequences. She was 6 months into a pregnancy he did not know existed. The child was his. The heir he had decided she was incapable of giving him was coming whether he knew about it or not, and the world was quietly rearranging itself around that fact in ways that neither of them could fully control. She thought about what she owed him. She thought about what he had cost her. She thought about the child, who owed nothing to either of them and deserved everything. She sat by the window until the rain came, and then she sat a while longer, listening to it. Not yet. Not tonight. There was still something she needed to understand fast, something about what she actually wanted from the moment when the truth finally arrived in Dominic Hartwell's life, as she now understood with complete certainty that it would. She needed to know whether she wanted to give him a chance to respond as a man, or whether she was only prepared to let him respond as a duke. That difference, she had come to understand, was the whole thing. 3 counties away, in the house he had built his entire sense of himself around, Lord Dominic Hartwell was not sleeping well. He would not have admitted this to anyone. He was not in the habit of admitting difficulties that could be categorized as personal. He had spent the better part of his adult life managing his own discomfort with an efficiency that other men sometimes admired and women he had been close to had eventually found deeply frustrating. He knew how to arrange his face. He knew how to fill a room with authority. He knew how to make a difficult decision and then continue forward as if the decision had cost nothing. He was finding, in the autumn of that year, that these skills were becoming progressively less useful to him. The house was the same. That was the strange thing. He had expected, when Alena left, that the absence would feel different from the presence. He had expected a lightness, or at least a neutrality, a return to the kind of clean, orderly quiet that he had always told himself he preferred. Instead, the house felt not emptier but more itself in a way he had not anticipated, as if the removal of her had made the house's essential character more visible rather than less. Its silences were longer. Its formalities had no friction against them anymore. He ate his meals at the long dining table alone. He worked in his study. He attended the social obligations of his title with the same outward steadiness he had always projected. He had 2 meetings with solicitors regarding the dissolution papers, and in both of those meetings he had conducted himself with the same disciplined detachment he brought to every legal matter, reviewing the terms, approving the conditions, and signing where indicated. He did not allow himself to think about Alena during those meetings. He thought about her constantly the rest of the time. He did not understand, at first, what was happening. He was a man who believed in reasoned decisions, in the supremacy of practical thinking over feeling, and he had made his decision about the marriage on what he believed were rational grounds. He had assessed the situation. He had weighed the years. He had concluded that the marriage had run its natural course and that both of them would find greater peace in separation than in continuation. He had been certain of this. He was no longer certain of it. The certainty had begun to loosen sometime in December, 6 weeks after Alena left. He could not point to a single moment when it happened. It was more like a door he had thought was closed turned out not to be latched, and the wind had been pushing it open a little at a time for weeks before he noticed. He noticed when he sat down at the desk in his study one evening to draft a response to a letter from a business associate and found himself unable to concentrate, not because he was distracted by anything specific but because the room felt wrong without the sound of her somewhere in the house. Alena had a way of being present in a house without imposing herself on it. She moved quietly. She did not interrupt his work. But there had always been, underneath the silence, some trace of her. The absence of that trace was not nothing. It was, he was now understanding, quite a lot. He began to review things. Not consciously, not as a deliberate exercise, but in the involuntary way that the mind returns to something it cannot resolve. He reviewed the last year of the marriage, the way his attention had narrowed and his patience had shortened and his assessment of Alena had shifted from admiration to a kind of managed disappointment, and he tried to understand, with the same clarity he brought to any problem, where exactly that shift had come from. What he found was not comfortable. He had been told, by two men he trusted, that the difficulty in the marriage was one-sided. That the lack of an heir was a matter pertaining to Alena, a conclusion supported by the losses she had endured and by the weight of the years without result. He had accepted this analysis. He had not questioned it with any rigor because it had aligned with a conclusion he was already leaning toward, and he was honest enough with himself, in the dark, solitary hours of this review, to recognize that this was not how a fair man reasons. He had built a case and then found the evidence to support it. He had told himself he was being practical when he had in fact been afraid of the possibility that the fault was shared or that there was no fault to assign and no answer to find, afraid of what it would mean to simply continue loving someone without the certainty of what the future held. He had dressed that fear in the language of pragmatism and called it a decision. He thought about the night he had told her. He thought about the way she had looked at him before she answered, the long, clear look of someone who was reading something very carefully. He thought about her question, whether there was anything he wanted to say to her, and his own answer, and the way her face had not moved when he gave it. He had thought, at the time, that her stillness meant acceptance. He now understood it meant something else entirely. It was the stillness of someone who has just understood something fully, who has completed a long calculation and arrived at a result they had been hoping not to find. He had told the woman he had married that everything that needed to be said had already been said. He had not said anything. He had handed her a document. In December, a misdirected letter passed through his hands. It was intended for a correspondence house and had been sent on to Ashford Hall by mistake. The outer envelope had her name on it, Alena Voss, in a handwriting he did not recognize. The address was a village in the county to the east. He held it for a long time. He turned it over. He did not open it. He did not allow himself to open it. But he noticed that the outer envelope had been stamped by the correspondence house with a notation that suggested the enclosed was related to professional work, translation services, which meant she had found something. She had not waited to be rescued. She had gone out and found something to build. He should not have been surprised. He knew her. He had known, from the evening they met, that she was capable of building things. He had simply stopped noticing it somewhere along the way a person stops noticing a light they have grown too used to. He forwarded the letter without opening it. He instructed his head of staff to ensure any future correspondence addressed to Alena Voss was to be redirected immediately to wherever she currently resided. He then walked to the window of the room where she used to read and stood there for a while. He was not a man who cried. He would not cry now. But there was something moving behind his face that had no other outlet, and he stood at the window and let it move through him and did not try to name it. He did not contact her. He told himself this was because he had no right to. He had made the decision. He had filed the papers. To appear on her doorstep now, expressing regret, would be to make her situation worse, to reopen something she was clearly working very hard to close. He would not do that to her. What he did instead was instruct his solicitors to ensure the settlement was handled fairly and completely, with no delays and no pressure. He told them to add a provision he had not included in the original terms, a quarterly payment that would continue for the rest of her life regardless of whether she remarried, funded from his personal accounts rather than the estate. He told himself it was the least he could do. The winter deepened. The spring came. Dominic moved through his life with the same composed exterior that had served him for 40 years, and underneath it he was doing something he had never done before. He was grieving. Not the idea of a marriage or the loss of a companion or even the absence of the heir he had spent years waiting for. He was grieving Alena, the specific person, the woman who had looked at him at that dinner 8 years ago with genuine curiosity rather than calculation, who had stayed beside him through 3 losses without once asking him to do more than he was capable of, who had loved him long after he had given her very little reason to. He received a letter from his solicitors in the early summer that gave him the first pause. There was a question arising from the original marriage contract, something regarding terms that had not been fully addressed in the dissolution proceedings. He instructed them to proceed carefully and without pressure on Elena's side. What he did not know, what no one had told him, was that by the time that letter was written, Elena was 6 months into a pregnancy. His heir, the child he had declared her incapable of giving him, was 3 counties away, growing strong and real and completely unaware of any of this. And Dominic Hartwell, the Duke of Ashford, a man who had prided himself on making decisions from a position of complete information, was about to discover how deeply, catastrophically wrong he had been. The child was born on a bright morning in September, in Harriet's upstairs room, with Dr. Wallace in attendance and the window open to let in the last of the warm air. He arrived without difficulty, which the doctor said was a good sign, and he was healthy, and he had a remarkable amount of dark hair for a newborn and a way of looking around the room that struck Elena, even in her exhaustion, as distinctly alert. She held him for a long time before she said anything. Harriet sat in the chair in the corner and pretended to read, which meant she was trying not to cry. Elena looked at her son's face. She had been prepared, in the way one prepares for something that cannot be fully anticipated, but even so, the reality of him was different from anything she had imagined. He was not abstract anymore. He was not a decision or a secret or a complicated future. He was a person, with a face, and a particular quality of attention, and small, perfect hands that gripped her finger with a strength that seemed to belong to someone older. She named him Oliver. The name had been her grandfather's, a man Elena had loved deeply and who had died when she was 10, but whose way of moving through the world, with patience and humor and a great willingness to sit quietly with other people's difficulties, had stayed with her all her life. She wanted her son to have something of that quality, not as a burden but as a possibility. Oliver Voss. She looked at the name in the small notebook where she had been writing things throughout the pregnancy, notes and thoughts and lists, and she thought about the other name he could carry. The name he would carry, by blood, whether she told anyone or not. She had spent the last several months thinking about this with great care. She had not made the decision out of anger. She had moved past anger sometime in the early spring, past the sharp, clarifying anger that had kept her upright in the early weeks, into something quieter and more complex. She understood now that Dominic had done what he did not out of cruelty but out of a kind of fear that he did not know how to acknowledge, the fear of a man who has built his entire identity on control and who panics, silently and invisibly, when control is not enough. That did not make what he did acceptable. But it made it legible. And legibility, she had found, was the first step toward being able to decide something without the decision being made entirely of pain. She had decided to tell him. Not because she owed it to him, though perhaps she did on some level. Not because she expected anything from him. But because Oliver deserved to exist in the truth. He deserved to know where he came from, when the time was right. And Dominic deserved, she had concluded, to know what his choices had cost him. Not as a punishment. As a fact. She wrote the letter when Oliver was 3 weeks old. She did not write it in anger and she did not write it in the language of accusation. She wrote it in the same clear, precise way she wrote everything, with careful attention to what she actually meant rather than what emotion was pushing her toward. She told him she was well. She told him she had been living in the country with her aunt. She told him that in September she had given birth to a son, and that the child was his, and that he was healthy. She told him she had not written sooner because she had needed time to understand what she wanted, and she had finally understood that what she wanted was for Oliver to grow up in the truth, whatever the truth cost everyone involved. She told him she was not writing to ask him to come back. She was not writing to accuse him of anything. She was writing because Oliver existed and was real and deserved a father who knew he existed, even if that father had a great deal of growing still to do before he was worthy of the role. She did not seal the letter that evening. She left it on the desk and went to check on Oliver, who was asleep in the small cot Harriet had found at the back of a cupboard and repainted white, and she stood looking at him in the dim light for a long time. She thought about the word worthy. She had written it without fully deciding how she felt about it, and now it was sitting in the letter on the desk, and she found that she had meant it. She did not want Oliver to have a father out of obligation. She did not want him to have a version of Dominic that showed up because he was required to, in the way that Dominic had always done things that were required of him. She wanted, if Oliver was going to have a father at all, for that man to have understood something true about himself first. She went back to the desk. She added one more paragraph. She told him that she was not hiding. She gave him the address. She told him that if he came, she hoped he would come not as the Duke of Ashford, not in his former capacity, but as a man who had looked honestly at what he had done and what he wanted to do differently. She told him that Oliver was not a solution to anything. He was a person, and he required the kind of love that was present and patient and willing to be wrong, and she needed to know, before she allowed him anywhere near her son, that Dominic Hartwell was capable of that. She signed it with her name. Not my lady. Not the Duchess. Her name. She sealed it the following morning and gave it to the post. Then she went back inside and picked up Oliver, who had woken and was making the small, exploratory sounds he made when he was not yet unhappy but was beginning to take an interest in the possibility of food, and she held him by the kitchen window where the autumn light came in clean and gold, and she told him, quietly, that whatever happened next, he was loved. He looked at her with those dark, attentive eyes. She told him again, just to be sure. The letter arrived at Ashford Hall on a Thursday. Dominic was in his study when it was brought to him, and he recognized the handwriting on the outer envelope before he had picked it up fully, and something in his chest did a thing he could not name. He sat down. He opened it. He read it twice. Then he set it on the desk and sat very still for a long time. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life believing that the right response to any situation was the measured one. He believed in thinking before acting. He believed in assessing before committing. He believed that emotion, while real, was not a reliable guide to good decisions. He stood up from the desk. He did not call for his valet. He did not send word ahead. He did not review the situation or weigh the options or draft a considered response. He put on his coat and he walked out of the house. He arrived at the village on a Saturday morning, on foot from the inn where he had left his carriage, without his crest and without any of the formal signifiers of his title. He had thought, on the journey, about what he would say. He had tried to prepare words. He had found, when the moment came and he was walking up the lane toward a small house with lavender growing beside the gate, that none of the words were adequate to what he was carrying. She saw him coming. He saw the movement at the window and then the front door open and she was standing in the frame, and she looked at him the way she had always looked at things, fully, without flinching, taking in what was actually there rather than what she hoped to see. She did not step aside immediately. He had not expected her to. He stopped at the gate. He held it with one hand. He looked at her. "I read your letter," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. He had thought, over the past months, that what he missed was the life they had built, the structure of it, the comfort of it. He understood now, standing in front of her, that what he missed was her, the actual person, the way she stood and thought and chose her words and looked at things. "I want to see him," he said. "If you will allow it." She did not answer immediately. She looked at him carefully, the way she used to in those early years, the way she had been looking at things all her life, trying to understand what was actually there. "Come inside," she said finally. He opened the gate. Inside, in the small sitting room that smelled of lavender and old books, Harriet was sitting with Oliver in her arms. She looked at Dominic when he entered with the expression of a woman who had a great deal to say and had decided, for now, not to say any of it. She stood up. "He has your eyes," she said to Dominic. And then she carried Oliver over to him and placed him in his arms before he had fully decided whether he was ready. Dominic held his son. He held him, and whatever he had been rehearsing, whatever composed and appropriate thing he had been preparing to say, went completely silent inside him. Oliver looked up at him with dark, steady eyes. The Duke of Ashford, who had never once broken his composure in public, who had built his entire self on the premise that control was the highest form of strength, felt something in his face give way completely. Alena stood near the door and watched. She watched him hold their son, and she watched the expression on his face, and she did not say anything. She let him have the moment without commentary, because she understood, in the way she understood most things that mattered, that this was the moment that would define what came after it. Not the marriage, not the title, not the papers or the letters or the formal proceedings. This moment, with a small person in his arms who was looking at him without any judgment at all. She had not made a decision yet. About what they would be to each other, what she would allow, how close she would let him come. She had told the truth in the letter and she had given him the address and she had opened the door when he came, and that was all she knew for certain. The rest would take time. The rest would require, from both of them, a willingness to be honest in the way that was hardest, not about facts, but about what they wanted, what they feared, and what they were prepared to become. She watched him with Oliver, and she thought that perhaps this was where it actually started. Not where it had ended. Where it actually started. Outside, the September light was coming in through the window, warm and clear, the kind of light that falls on things without asking anything of them, and it fell on the three of them, the Duke who had learned something terrible and true about himself, the woman who had built something real from nothing, and the small, alert person who had arrived into all of this with no idea of any of it and a great deal of time still ahead. Oliver made a sound. Dominic looked at Elena. She crossed the room and stood beside them. That was enough, for now. That was exactly enough.